Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to our session. So really delighted to welcome you all here to the official launch of the EHPS Open Science Special Interest Group. Myself and Emma are particularly excited to be launching the SIG with a roundtable session called What is Open Science and How Can It Improve the Quality of Health Psychology Research? And I think you'll all agree we have a host of absolutely exemplary speakers. We're really excited, and thank you all for joining us. So before we start the session and outline the session and introduce our speakers, I'd just like to say briefly a few words about the SIG itself. So we were established at the start of this year, and just really briefly, our aims are to bring together health psychologists interested in open science behaviours, to share best practices and innovations in open science to health psychologists, to provide guidance and or training on open science, to promote the role of health psychology for improving open science across disciplines, to liaise with organisations which promote open science, and also to encourage and reward replication and reproducibility within health psychology. So we have a very active and dedicated committee, so co-chaired by myself and Emma Norris from Brunel University, and I'm sure you'll all notice a few familiar faces here. So we're from across 5 different countries, and we're also supported by a really fantastic advisory group. So since setting up, we also have over 30 additional members from 11 countries and over 160 Twitter followers, and we aim to grow that a lot over the next while. So the previous aims that we outlined, we've done pretty well, I think, given the current context. COVID scuppered a lot of our plans for EHPS originally, but we've managed to, we're really delighted to have the roundtable here, and we'll be planning a lot of different events over the next year. So we'll be announcing a couple of those at the end of this session. So with that, I'd like to hand you over to Emma, who's going to outline the session and introduce our speakers. And just thank you all very much for tuning in, and looking forward to a really engaging session.
Thanks, Elaine. So yeah, our roundtable is entitled What is Open Science and How Can It Improve the Quality of Health Psychology Research? Next slide, please, Elaine. It's my final one. And so we're really pleased today to have 5 fantastic speakers who are all going to speak for 10 minutes each. Robert and Susan are kindly going to share a spot. So firstly, we have Professor Darya Connor from University of Leeds in the UK speaking about international strategies to increase open science. Then next we have Dr. Talia Cornelius from Columbia University in the US speaking on putting open science into practice, the science of behaviour change measures repository. Thirdly, we have Dr. G.J. Peters, Open University of the Netherlands in the Netherlands, on linking resources and promoting interoperability. And finally, we have Professor Susan Michie and Robert West from UCL in the UK, speaking about how can we update and sustain open science tools in the long term. So a really packed agenda for this hour. We're really excited, and thanks again to all the speakers that we have. So just for practical reasons, the way we'll run the session is that we'll have all of the speakers speaking one after another with a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. And as with all the other presentations so far in the conference, we'll just do that by raising your hand, and then we'll unmute you to ask your question. And that's it for the introduction. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who's Darya Connor. Fantastic, showing the screen, all working well. So thanks very much, Daryl. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Emma, and it's great to be here, and also to Elaine for organising this event. And it really is wonderful to be at an EHPS online event. So what I want to try and do in the next 10 minutes is, in fact, not just talk about what I've described here as international strategies for to increase open science. A better title is actually strategies just to improve open science per se. And indeed, what I want to do is talk about how we can turn the threats of the replication crisis into opportunities. And I want to cover these 4 aspects very briefly. And one of the key things I want to do is point people to resources that you may not be aware of in this context. But a useful starting point is to consider what I believe is a really excellent, simple notion. Health psychology and health psychologists have been leading the way now for many years. We've been publishing our trials, our behaviour change interventions, our reviews in the appropriate repositories in advance. So we have been doing some great work. But it's time now for us to raise our game further. And one of the ways we can do this is via registered reports. So those who are not familiar with registered reports are a technique where peer review of results happens before the results are known. So this is the notion that we develop an idea, we design a study, and then we have it reviewed. So we send it for peer review, and then it's revised, and if it's accepted, we then collect the data. And then we write the paper, and then all being well, the paper's published. And this new way, new approach is likely to reduce questionable research practices. But in terms of international ways going forward, certainly in the United Kingdom, I've been involved, and many other colleagues have been trying to make registered reports the norm across all the British journals. So between May 2017 and July 2018, we launched across all 11 journals registered reports. No other psychological society in the world has done that. And one of the things that I write about here in this particular launch quotation was, the introduction of registered reports will increase the transparency of our science. It will allow peer review of research studies before results are known. As a consequence, this will help reduce the use of questionable research practices while improving the quality of our research protocols and ultimately the robustness of our evidence base. So this is an excellent starting point. But even more exciting, across the 11 journals that we launched over the recent past, it's great to see the very first registered report is in the British Journal of Health Psychology. Health Psychology leading the way. But what else is relevant here? So in the European Health Psychology Society, we've also been doing lots of great work to embrace open science. So when I was editor of Psychology and Health, we introduced registered reports in our journal. And we also know in the Health Psychology Bulletin led by GJ and his colleagues, they've also been doing great works of embracing many different aspects of open science. And indeed, I should also say we've got our great open access journal, Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine as well. So great work happening there. But let's just look at this one slide to really emphasize the importance of introducing registered reports. So this is data from a great study by Ange Neal and colleagues, in which they show, if you look at the right-hand bar here, so if you look at studies published using registered reports, less than half of them support their hypothesis. So this just realizes that registered reports hopefully will further increase the robustness of our evidence base going forward. But what else can we do? So I think there's other simple aspects. Pre-registration is hugely important. So many colleagues are still feeling that registered reports take much longer to engage with. So another way is pre-registration. And pre-registration is an easy way in which we can divide clearly between confirmatory research and exploratory research. By pre-registering our research in advance, we can look at hypothesis testing versus hypothesis generating. And personally, my favorite tool is As Predicted. So colleagues who are not familiar with As Predicted, I urge you to go and look at this website. This is just one of many techniques, but it's an easy way to register your research. And this again will help reduce questionable research practices and harking. But actually, I think it's important to think of this in the context of COVID-19. Many of us have seen an explosion of research trying to quickly deal with and understand COVID-19. Therefore, I urge colleagues to use As Predicted and other tools, and I'll come back to that at the very end. The other thing that I've been involved in leading is I've been involved in this international task force to try and simplify pre-registration. We understand that pre-registration, there are many different tools. So this is a joint working party from APA, BPS, and the German Psychological Society. And you can see there's a range of colleagues represented here. And we're hoping to launch this new template in the autumn of this year. And so I urge colleagues to watch this space. But what else can we do? The other thing is I'd like to point colleagues to is journal article reporting standards. These are known as JARs. So JARs, we've got three types of JARs. There's JARs Quant, JARs Qual, and JARs Mixed. And actually, I'm aware that not many people, or there's room for many people, more people to look at these particular papers and these publications. And the reason why they're important is that I've noted here is that using these standards will make your research clearer and more accurate, as well as more transparent for readers. But crucially is this last sentence. For quantitative research, using standards such as these will increase reproducibility of science. For qualitative research, using these standards will increase the methodological integrity of our research. So ultimately, I'm pointing health psychologists and psychologists more generally to these reporting standards. So what else do I want to talk about? I also want to talk about meta-analysis. And this is something that I've articulated in this recent commentary that I've written for Health Psychology Review. So just earlier, a number of months ago, there was an excellent special issue on self-regulation and involving lots of meta-analyses and meta-analyses of meta-analyses. And one of the things that I think was important is that we have a real opportunity. Health psychologists use meta-analyses and systematic reviews incredibly well. We are the people who are trying to synthesize the cumulative science in our field in a meaningful way. But one of the things I talk about in that commentary is that we can try and improve the reproducibility of meta-analyses further. And I was very struck by this really nice paper by Daniel Atkins, in which Daniel outlines 6 key recommendations, simple things such as disclosing our meta-analytical data, facilitating quality control, adhering to well-established guidelines such as PRISMA, which we all use, pre-registering our meta-analysis, which we use. But also, there's other things about producing, making our scripts open. And I'll come back to that at the very end. But also about recruiting expertise when you feel it's necessary. But if you haven't read the paper of Daniel's, but also the commentary, then please do look at it. But there's a couple of final things I want to talk about. Open science badges is another excellent technique which we can use to really increase transparency in research. This can be badges about pre-registration, data, and materials. And on the right-hand side of this particular graphic, you'll see that after open science badges were introduced, there was a marked increase in availability of open data. A simple intervention which has a desired outcome. Which leads to me, one of the final things I want to talk about. In the British Psychological Society, we've been very keen to embrace open data. And we have recently published a statement, there's a working group in the UK, a statement on open data. So from next year, we really want to encourage across all of our journals to use open data and make it. And in fact, our mantra is this principle, that data should be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And again, I urge colleagues, if you haven't read the statement, to read it at the link below. But the final thing is I want to refer to is this really nice paper that Emma and I have put together, which was published in Psychology and Health, where we conceptualize science as behavior. And as health psychologists, we're incredibly well placed to use behavior change approaches to increase open science uptake. So again, if you haven't seen this paper, please, I urge you to read it, and I'm sure you'll take something from it. And then the final thing is a shameless plug of a recent paper that a large group of us put together. And the reason why I'm flagging it here is because this, in addition to identifying what we believe are the 7 key research priorities for COVID-19 pandemic in terms of psychological science, what we make very clear is we argue the importance of open science when we're doing COVID-related research, maintaining credibility and integrity, and also we urge colleagues to pre-register work and to use registered reports when they can. So what are my take-home messages over the last, which I believe, if I look at my timing, in the last 9 minutes, are these very simple 5 messages. Pre-registration is very straightforward. We should all try and use it. We should also start trying embracing registered reports. It's an important tool which will improve science. What I haven't talked about today at all, but I think it's important that we reflect upon it, is the incentive structure of science is broken. That architecture needs to change. And again, by having the SIG that's been organized today and going forward is one additional way of doing that. Open science should be central to all psychological training, including health psychology. But the final positive note I lead on is I could have given a talk for an hour where I talk about health psychology leading the way, as well as psychological science more generally. So the future's bright. We all just need to engage. So thank you very much for listening and to the last 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for an amazing summary. I don't know how you fit all that into 10 minutes. Really impressive stuff, and really great to kind of hear a bit more about how health psychology fits into the wider context of open science. So thank you so much, Daryl. Really much appreciated. So as I said before, we're going to have general discussion at the end of the session. So now I'd like to welcome our second speaker, who's Talia Cornelius, to present on the science of behaviour change open measures repository. So welcome, Talia, to share your screen and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my video is off, so I apologize. I tried to turn it on and it's not letting me turn it on. There we go. All right, I'm also managing 2 screens, so if I'm looking away, that is why. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we at the Science of Behavior Change Initiative are trying to implement and promote open science. I'm going to start with a brief overview of SOBC and then introduce one of the tools that we have developed or resources in order to promote open science, and then I will briefly touch on some future plans. Broadly at SOBC, the goal is to develop and apply a common scientific method that is systematic, rigorous, and ultimately quite transparent, which we term the experimental medicine approach, in order to help understand mechanisms that underlie behavior change. As you are probably all aware, behavioral interventions often fail to elicit a real change, and when these interventions do succeed, the changes can often be quite small, difficult to maintain, and/or difficult to replicate. And part of that reason may be that we don't really know why interventions do or do not work. This is the black box of behavior change research. The experimental medicine approach aims to open up this black box and focus on the mechanisms that underlie behavior change, allowing researchers to develop targeted interventions that can influence these mechanisms. So this is broken down into 4 broad steps. The first is that you identify an underlying mechanism of behavior change, so some measurable dimension, for example, of self-regulation. You might say temporal discounting, and this will be a theory-based hypothesis. The next step is to measure and validly assess that mechanism. You can see these as you step through the bars at the bottom of the page. After that, you will demonstrate how to reliably influence that mechanism. So can you actually cause somebody to change in an appreciable way on your hypothesized mechanism of change? And then finally, the goal is to determine whether or not changing that mechanism correlates with the change in the desired behavior. So if I manage to change self-regulation, which I am operationalizing as temporal discounting, does that indeed correlate with changes in physical activity or medication adherence, and so on. At the Columbia SOBC Coordinating Center, our goal is to use this experimental medicine approach to improve behavior change research, but also to promote transparency and open science. And one of the tools that we have developed is a repository of validated measures of mechanisms of behavior change. This is an online resource, and I would encourage everyone to visit the URL at the bottom of the screen, the measures.scienceofbehaviorchange.org. And that details all the different measures of these hypothesized mechanisms of behavior change that are currently being tested as part of the SOBC Research Network. And they also now have incorporated measures from other repositories in order to make this as broad and useful as possible. So repositories like GEM or MIDSS. This is just an image showing the front page of the repository. You see the little SOBC badges, identify ones that are the hypothesized mechanisms of behavior change, and there are filters on the side to help facilitate searching. I also just want to point out a couple key features. So you see there is a documentation, so you see identified and measured. We are really trying to get everybody who uploads these measures to document their progress through the steps of the experimental medicine approach, so that anyone who goes to access the measure can say, this measure can be influenced, and here is a paper or a citation showing how it was influenced in a previous study. It also allows you to download the measure and the scoring. You can access related articles in Google Scholar or related measures. So this is a self-regulation measure. You see a couple of others listed at the bottom. And then finally, on the side, you also see a link to the study's open science framework documentation. SOBC is very committed to open science, and so we're placing this rigor, reproducibility, transparency at the forefront of our efforts. And that is why we've required the open science documentation for each measure that has been uploaded. There are a number of challenges associated with the repository. So currently we are actively maintaining it at the Coordinating Center, and all the measures are being uploaded by SOBC network members. The ultimate goal is to create a self-sustaining repository where scientists can upload measures even when they're not part of the network, and also document their progression through the steps of the validation process. A couple of challenges include that we can't really impel scientists to do this. It's an added step of uploading measures, documenting their progression through all the steps. It's a fair amount of work, particularly given a proliferation of resources on tools online to promote open science, which is a wonderful problem to have, but still a challenge nonetheless. And then another challenge of creating a self-sustaining repository is just some sort of oversight of quality or duplicates in measures. One thing to touch on briefly in my last couple of minutes, I'm trying to barrel through so I don't overstep my time. One step, and I believe the next person will also be speaking about this, is interoperability of resources. So we have a current plan in place to try to link the measures to another online tool. And other future goals would include things like facilitating comparison of measure internal consistency, reliability, or validity across different types of participant populations, and then possibly even creating easy ways for scientists to access the information regarding the ability to influence a measure, so different intervention mechanism links and different mechanism behavior links. So truly cumulative and open science. So as you can see here, the measures repository is really primarily concerned with these things that lie under this global mechanism. We have a whole bunch of different measures that in theory measure this mechanism. And then there are these other pathways, which we haven't really touched on with the repository. So the behavior mechanism link and the intervention mechanism link. And one of the future things that we're working on now, which is quite exciting, is linking the Sovc measures repository to the theories and techniques tool. And this is a tool created by the Human Behavior Change Project, which has linked behavior change techniques to mechanisms of action. So if you recall the last slide, we're focused on measures of mechanisms in the repository, but we really don't speak about the overarching mechanism itself. And we're currently in the process of linking these Sovc measures that we've been curating at the RCC to the mechanisms of action that have been coded and curated in this tool by the Human Behavior Change Project. We're going to conduct a 3-round expert consensus study to start to provide some preliminary content validity for these measures, and then also be able to link these online tools so that if I'm interested in a certain measure, I could say, it looks like it's linked to this mechanism, at least on some degree of consensus, and oh wow, maybe there's a little bit of evidence for this behavior change technique. Maybe that will inform my intervention. And sort of conversely, if you know that you're interested in memory and decision-making processes, you might be able to go to the theories and techniques tool and then somehow access the list of all the measures that we have curated in the open repository, so that you can use those if you desire in the design and conduct of your study. I just want to quickly acknowledge my co-collaborators and say thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Talia, for, well, firstly getting up so early in the morning to give this presentation and sticking to time, but also for giving us an insight into a really invaluable resource that's useful to everyone here. And great to see the development of this year on year. Fantastic. Our next speaker is GJ. Ready to go? Take it away.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Thank you very much. It's really cool to be a speaker in this very distinguished list of speakers. So I'll try to speak quickly enough and stay within the time. The slides are already up on the OSF meetings page, which also is what this QR code is for. It will be shown again on the last slide. My talk is about interoperability, which is basically about stuff talking to each other. But of course, it also has a more formal definition. And that's important because that distinguishes it from compatibility. So compatibility is when two things can work together. Interoperability is when it's actually more, well, you could call it actually the open science approach to compatibility. So when the process is open from the get-go and when it's developed and developed using and uses open standards. So two products can be compatible, but how to create another product that's also compatible with those products can remain unavailable, and then it's not actually interoperable. So those open standards require building on other open formats or standards, making them publicly available, of course, licensing them such that they can be easily shared. And again, important, the process is also important. So development of the standards has to be open for everybody to view and to participate in. And that's kind of covered nicely by open science, especially if you do it the completely open way and you actually use resources like Git to make everything open from the beginning, instead of just uploading stuff whenever you're ready, but just allowing everybody to see what you're doing while you're working on stuff. So back to connecting stuff together. In psychology, that's a bit challenging because our constructs are often ill-defined, and our measures of those constructs often don't actually measure the same thing when they pretend to measure the same thing. And measures for different constructs might actually measure the same thing. This has been shown for many fields. It's actually even a problem for clinical psychology, which is slightly more urgent because people with depression actually sometimes don't receive the help they need, because the measurement that's used as part of the diagnostic process determines whether they actually get the diagnosis or not. But it's also a problem in health psychology, and this is kind of related to how we approach validity. Cronbach and Meehl, long time ago, in '52, I think, invented the concept of construct validity, because criterion validity and content validity, which were mainly used up until then, don't work for psychological constructs. And the problem is that they had quite a strong, rigorous proposal for how to evaluate construct validity, but that's actually not used in psychology. What actually people do most of the time when they look at validity is just look at correlations, either using factor analyses or regular correlations, or using item analyses, using omega, or maybe even coefficient alpha. And that's problematic. The way validity is conceptualized within the construct validity approach isn't actually validity. Validity isn't defined. Construct validity isn't defined as whether a measurement instrument measures what it's supposed to measure. Therefore, people have proposed that we should just stop using it at all. So there are lots of interesting discussions here. And the problem kind of originates because this is what we study. We study people's brains, and we have a lot of neurons with a lot of connections to other neurons. A lot of connections to other neurons, and those neurons can fire very, very frequently. So that means that the actual thing in the real world that we want to study is basically unstudyable. So we do different things. We define constructs like attitude, intention, perceived behavioral control, and we have theories stating how those constructs influence other constructs. The problem is that over time, it's quite easy to start thinking of those constructs as if they exist like that in your mind, kind of like a new type of phrenology almost, as if attitude is something in the mind. Some time ago at the EHPS, I presented a somewhat depressing paper where we argue that actually they don't exist, and we should stop thinking as if they do, which of course has pretty big implications for how we approach measurement. The underlying problem is that what we study are not natural kinds. What we study isn't something that exists in the real world the way water or the boiling point of water does. Everything with 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom is water. That's just the definition, and that's actually how it exists in the real world. And water boils at around 100 degrees Celsius. So if you study this, and if you use different measurement instruments, you will always find that roughly 100 degrees Celsius. You can define boiling differently, but still you won't find -10 or 500 degrees Celsius. We don't have those natural kinds, we have neurons. And one of the consequences is that if you want to measure a construct with a measurement instrument, or you use a different scale, or a different scale, or a different scale, you don't actually measure the same thing. You measure different things as soon as you start changing the text in our items. Related to this, we actually have different definitions. So not only are our constructs ill-defined, our constructs also have different definitions. So there are different definitions of attitude that all kind of cut out different bits of people's psychology. And to make it even more complicated, they're all fine. There's not actually a correct definition because attitude is not a natural kind. It's not like a bit of our head. We don't actually have this nice little square in our head that's attitude. So that means that all those definitions are wrong in a way, which is fine because they're still useful. But that also means that this variation in definitions and in measurement instruments is not in itself a bad thing. Actually, there's also been a lot of research about variation in research and diversity. And diversity is actually something that helps research. So we actually want to maintain this. So the situation is that constructs, the stuff that Talia just called mechanisms, basically the stuff in people's head that's actually targeted by an intervention, because obviously interventions can't directly change behavior, they always have to work through people's psychology. Those constructs are not natural kinds. That means that there's no actual definition that is really true, that really defines the real attitude or the real social norms. And diversity benefits science. This all means that there's no actually sense in centralizing or trying to create a curated authoritative list. Actually, that would slow down science. So, how do we achieve interoperability? How do we get to the situation where if you have different studies, they unequivocally talk about the same construct? So what we would need is basically tying together the definition of a construct, a way to develop measurement instruments for the construct for a given target behavior and a different population, a way to code measurement instruments when you do a systematic review, a way to code qualitative data, and a way to elicit construct content. And these all have to be consistent with each other. They have to be sufficiently accurate, detailed, and consistent. So they will be wrong, but at least we will know exactly what we're talking about. One way to approach this, of course, is the ontology approach. And this is very, years ago, I would have said it was megalomaniac, but Susan and Robert and the entire team are actually pulling it off. But it's definitely very impressive and not something every group can do. But this project also yields a lot of very useful resources, like, for example, this paper, which allows you to describe any theory using a limited set of, constructs, a limited set of concepts, such as types of relationships. Another approach is something we've been working on in Limerick, which are decentralized construct taxonomies, which are a way to give everybody the tools to create these very explicit definitions. So they're decentralized because everybody can use them, they're about constructs, and they're taxonomies because they help you with defining constructs and with actually identifying them out in the real world by looking at qualitative data or quantitative data. So basically what these are is that they allow you to specify a label, a human readable label, which doesn't matter so much because we have a unique identifier that is actually the unique name to refer to this set of information. And then for this construct, you define it, you add an instruction for developing measurement instruments that's completely consistent with the definition. You add an instruction for coding measurement instruments, an instruction for developing aspects, and an instruction for coding aspects. And of course, as I indicated earlier, this is not about the natural kind. So the recent action approach defines experiential attitude belief evaluations. Those don't exist in your head, so you can have discussions about these definitions. But that's fine as long as in one of those DCT specifications, everything is consistent with each other. And as long as we use the unique construct identifier to refer to the specification, at least we're all talking about exactly the same thing. And to show an example of interoperability that's been achieved already, these DCT specifications can also include links with other constructs. So this model I showed earlier has actually been generated by this Cyverse R package from a set of DCT specifications. So if we want to achieve interoperability, the easy thing is make sure that we do everything completely openly from the get-go. See the link again for these slides to demonstrate that. The hard part is to make sure we're talking about exactly the same thing without resorting to creating some authoritative list, without resorting to centralization. And of course, to practice what we preach, these are the links to the slides. The second link has DCTs for the recent action approach. And at the bottom is a repository that will be creating to have a lot of those DCTs. So you can look at those for different constructs. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, DJ. A really, really interesting talk and lots of ideas and food for thought on how we can all work a bit more collaboratively and also importantly build on the really great work that we know is already existing in the area, especially related to behaviour change. So thank you very much, and we'll continue those discussions at the end after our final talk, which is being shared by Susan, Michie and Robert West, I think on respective computers, although there's Robert. So will you be sharing slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
Susan's just going to share screen too.
Let's just do whatever works.
Yeah, don't worry. Okay, and there we will go to. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah,
all right?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Robert. Great to have technical assistance. So we've heard some really excellent examples of tools that are useful now and going to be useful in the future. And one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few years is how we are able to maintain and update these tools over time, long after the likes of me and others have gone on to do different things. I'm going to talk just to illustrate the general point with the Human Behaviour Change project that Talia mentioned earlier, and then Robert's going to talk about diction research tools. But really what I'm going to talk about applies to everything, and I don't have any answers. I've got one potential solution that I'm trying, but I think others may have other ideas. So the Human Behaviour Change project is on open science framework, and everything is shared as we go along. And the tools that it's producing, the behaviour change intervention ontology, which is all about increasing interoperability, not about standardization, but it means that people can have their own what's called namespaces and link with what other people are also using. And this includes the behaviour change technique taxonomy. Talia mentioned the theory and techniques tool, which is part of the overall project. We also have an evaluation report search tool, an information extraction tool, outcome prediction tool. In development, an AI-based knowledge system, and we're beginning to develop the user interface. Now, all these products are open access. On the left is Welcome Open Research. The project's funded by the Wellcome Trust, and they have an open research publication platform. So that's where we're putting all of our papers, and you post them, and then you get post-publication peer reviews, and they get ticks as you get the peer reviews going through the system. And then on the right, we have GitHub, where we're putting the different products that we're producing. We will go on and make some of these more user-friendly over time, but they're all there. And the computer science part of the collaboration is also producing code and other products as they go. And that should be all on the website. So what, over time, we need to do, I think, is strike a balance between the stability of tools, so the tools can get used, can get tested, can get feedback on where it works, where it doesn't, how it can be improved. But also, one wants them stable for a time, but one doesn't want them tablets of stone. So they need to be updated as the underlying science advances, and as we get more feedback from user experience, and also as the context circumstances change. One of the things that I think we're all committed to doing is extending the engagement with these tools globally, especially to resource poor countries. So to try and ensure that the tools that are produced are as widely shared as possible. But that does mean some kind of active promotion so that others can find out about them. And as I said previously, last beyond the lifetime of the original tool developers. This needs a mechanism for it to happen. And I've resisted sort of publishing in terms of, or putting things into a sort of a company commercializing in any way, charging for it. I mean, that's the obvious way. If you want to maintain it, and that's been an argument for commercialization, you need money to maintain it. Commercializing it and charging money is one way of doing that. I've resisted that and looked at another mechanism. Now we have fantastic resources and tools that are in real trouble because they don't have a mechanism for long-term maintenance and updating. So the wonderful Cochrane collaboration lives totally hand to mouth. And speaking to Jeremy Grimshaw, who is chair of it for many years, it's a really awful situation to be in. Very time intensive for the people contributing to it, very stressful, and continually trying to get money to keep the whole wonderful global project going. And then we've got Equator that produces reporting guidelines like Consort and many others that we'll be familiar with. And I was sitting on our Medical Research Council when they came back for further funding. And our MRC said, you know, this is a global resource. Why should the UK be funding this on this piecemeal way? And I also went to the same panel, the methodology panel, to get an updated or a mechanism to update the behaviour change technique taxonomy. And they were fine with the science, but they didn't want to fund something that was going to have to carry on being updated. So the possibility I've come up with is to seek money to establish a platform or resource for long-term maintenance. The funding would be got through a not-for-profit company. So it could come through kind of products and services associated with the tool, which could include training and consultancy, you know, support for using it. In terms of ensuring scientific development, the thought I had, rather than the advisory, scientific advisory groups of individuals that we know and respect and would like advice from, that's not going to last, because sadly human beings don't last. So I thought steering committees made up of representatives of scientific and professional bodies globally could do that, you know, going forward forever and a day. So I have tried this model with Mary Johnson, other colleagues, Alex Rothman, Linda Collins, and other, and Joe Hart and Lucy Byrne-Davids, to try and get funding for updating this. And we've just got a letter just back saying that although they're not funding it, they invited for a reapplication for it. And I'm always happy to share anything that can be useful with people, because we actually had to get a grant to fund a consultant to put forward a business case to try and convince the funders. Unfortunately, it's not strong enough, so they have offered to meet and give feedback. So for anybody who's interested, I can share that feedback as and when I get it. So that's really where I am, and just be really interested to hear other people's thoughts about other ways of achieving this longer term maintenance and updating of the incredible range of tools that we're collectively producing. And now over to Robert.
Okay, if you want to just stop sharing your screen, then I'll start sharing mine. And
I'll do that.
You just click on, you just move your thing to the up to the top of the screen, and then it'll have a red button which says stop share.
Oh, gosh.
All right, don't worry. I'll
no, I've got it. Got it. Sorry about that.
Okay, I shall start sharing. Okay. Okay, can everyone see those slides all right?
Yep, we can.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just give you a couple of examples from the addiction research stable of where we think we might go on this issue of sustainability. Just two products. One is the paper authoring tool, which we developed, which is an online tool. It was designed for addiction papers, not just the journal addiction, but any papers in addiction. And it actually is limited at the moment to 2-arm randomized controlled trials in terms of its full usage, but there are many features of it and modules that people could use if they want for other sorts of papers that might help them. And the other is the addiction ontology, and GJ mentioned the issue of ontologies and the potential that they provide to improve clarity when it comes to letting people know what you're talking about and the relationships between the various things that you're talking about. So with these two tools, on the bottom left here is just a screenshot from the paper authoring tool. It comes as a set of modules, and the idea there is that when you're writing up, actually probably a good idea to use a tool like this when you're developing your study, because it prompts you for things that you're going to have to be able to talk about when it comes to writing them up. And one of the problems is if you haven't collected the information, you can't report on it. But worth having a look at. I've got the links, I think, in another slide. So the tool's been developed for 2-arm randomized controlled trials, and it's just the beginning. It links up with the addiction ontology in that it provides authors with drop-down lists for key constructs, for example, outcome measures and things. One point that GJ made, which was very important, was around the issue of constructs that have that are construed differently by different research groups or researchers. But there are many things in the field of addiction, and I think in health psychology generally, where they're the same thing, and so you want to be able to refer to them. And outcome measures are an example of that. You know, when you're talking about smoking cessation, continuous abstinence, you need clarity on that. So it uses the ontology to prompt you for the kinds of things that you might want to report. Now that has been funded so far by around, I mean, in total, not including my time or anything like that, probably around £60,000 worth of money from the Society for the Study of Addiction, and they have a commitment to continuing to support that. The addiction ontology, and on the slide here, there's just a screenshot from Addicto-Vocab, which is a first stab at a interface for accessing the ontology. For the addiction ontology also, we have funding from the Society for the Study of Addiction. Now, so what kind of ownership models, you know, might work for tools like that? Well, Susan's already mentioned funding models for other things, but actually we also have to think about ownership models. What is the kind of legal entity that is going to take charge of this thing and have control over it? So I've split those out into owner and funder. And owners might be things like learned societies. The Society for the Study of Addiction might want to do it. It might be a university, or as Susan pointed out, it might be a community interest company. Now that can be separated out from the funding scheme. So for example, let's say you set up a community interest company, that wouldn't stop you necessarily getting grants from grant awarding bodies or seeking endowments. So you could have any combination of those owner and funding relationships. The way I think it's probably going to go in the long term for tools like addiction ontology and PAT is that it will be something probably rather like what's used with Chaos, which is this open access publishing platform, which it'll be a very small user fee, essentially be free for most of its functionality, but certain functionalities you might pay a small user fee. And that would be kind of the order of the sort of thing that you might pay for Netflix or something like that. So it wouldn't be prohibitive. And obviously there'd be an option potentially for organizations like universities and so on to do some institutional fee. The advantage of that, I think, is that it gives you more, in a way, more security in terms of knowing that you've got a structure that will continue indefinitely. And in a way, it gives you more freedom to pursue the kind of developments that you might want without having to keep going back to grant awarding bodies or other people to say, well, you know, what do you think of this model? So essentially you're selling a service, but you're doing it at cost. And actually, when you look at the costs, the fees can be really small. You know, you don't need that many users to provide enough money to make it work. So that's basically it. I'll stop sharing and then can see what people would like to talk about.
Great, thanks so much, Robert and Susan. We've got about 10 or so minutes left for questions. And I saw in the chat that Justin had a question that he posed a while ago. So Justin, if I can allow you to ask a question. Should be okay to speak now.
Sorry, it was just a quick question from an earlier presentation around how the reporting initiatives within the discipline, within psychology, and particularly the APA JARS, link up with the broader reporting guidance from, for example, Equator.
Do you want me to answer that, Emma?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, just a very good point. I mean, again, they're integrated, so the idea is that they will point to these guidance in the same way. So obviously Equator is very broad. So they should be integrated. And I see Equator as more a facilitating tool, whereas the reporting guidelines obviously are just a lower level. So yeah, I think they're just there to point to it. But I think what we need to do is think carefully about this level of specificity and whether or not we need, as a discipline, more detailed guidance, and actually some of the JARs provide that, whereas other areas don't.
Thanks.
Can I just make a comment in relation to that, if I may? And that is, in my role as editor of Addiction, one of the things that has really struck me about this issue of pre-registration and so on is the fact that people will often say, and rightly say, that they pre-registered their study, but that still leaves a lot of scope in the analysis plan. And I think we need to be very clear about the issue of pre-registration of studies in their broad scope, but also the analysis plan in detail. And I would particularly, I favour people lodging their SPSS code or SAS or R code prior to pressing the button on the analysis. And I think that's something we should try and encourage.
Yeah, no, Robert, I completely agree with that. It's entirely, I kind of see it as a process. So we're over time, we're all changing. So that's why I was arguing that an easier way is the pre-registration, like the as predicted. You don't necessarily have to have a detailed on that analysis plan, but I would hope in a couple of years' time, every single pre-registration would have a detailed analysis plan. And then, and hopefully many people will move to registered reports. 100% agree.
I think maybe if we're lucky, we'll move on to like everybody synthesizing data sets beforehand, simulating data sets, using those to estimate their sample sizes, and already having their analysis scripts ready to apply. And then they just can submit all of this with their pre-registration over time.
Daryl, anecdotally, what types of feedback are you getting from say authors and people submitting to the journals about the push toward registered reports? Like, for people, is the biggest barrier time, or is it lack of awareness, or?
I mean, that's a really excellent question, Elaine. I mean, so many of the barriers are ill-founded. Things like they feel they're going to be scooped, or they feel it's going to take much longer. And every single barrier, you know, and the lack of creativity, they somehow believe that it's stifling creativity. And all of these things just aren't true. There is no data to suggest it stifles creativity. It just allows you to be upfront with exactly what you've done. It speaks to the issue that Robert just mentioned. So the sort of feedback is it's slow. So certainly across the 11 journals of the BPS, within the first year of trialing it, we'd received only a handful of registered reports. That's changing. But I think the more people use it, recognizing it doesn't stifle things, it allows you to be very transparent at what you're doing, and it allows people to go, I've found something interesting, but we need to replicate that before we've any truth in it.
So maybe something that like the SIG could promote or something is like a dispelling myths type of thing, where we look at what people perceive and believe about things at the moment, and then, you know, we develop some sort of communication stuff based on those to target them.
Absolutely, great idea.
Anna Van Dongen was just saying there in the chat, we had a survey here at York and not many people knew what registered reports even were. This was across all disciplines, mind, which I suppose is important as well to know.
I mean, it's funny you say, Elaine, because actually when I was preparing this talk, I thought, well, I'd spent so much time on registered reports thinking that lots of people know about them. But actually the point is many people still don't know. So that's Anna's point confirms that.
Yeah. And also actually about open science. You know, quite often when I'm talking in different countries around the world, I'll just say to the audience, put up your hands, who's heard of open science? And it's usually a handful. I continue to be shocked. I mean, I do think Daryl's right that UK and health psychology, I think, are ahead of the game. So in terms of getting into people's consciousness, I think it's a really good thing to do. Anytime we give a talk anywhere, is just ask people to put up their hands. Who's here heard of open science? And then just say, go and Google open science framework. you know, and I think that way we can begin to make quite a difference in this area.
Vera had a question.
Yeah. It's a question for Susan. Just to think from her opinion, for Susan and for Robert, actually, what could scientific societies do to support the sustainability of these open science initiatives and registers?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question. And it goes back to what Robert was talking about, you know, who's going to own this in the long term. And, you know, the model I was thinking about was a not-for-profit company. But if there's an organization which, you know, seems to be quite central for the particular tool. So, for example, the behavior change technique taxonomy or other tools that other health psychologists have produced, it could be that the EHPS wants to look at actually, you know, becoming the long-term host and owner of it, and that it does get set up in a model. I mean, my model was have the actual tool free for everyone, but then charge for the consultancy and the training around it. But then that doesn't need people to do that. I think Robert's idea of a kind of, which I know a lot of smart formats do, is a very basic version that's free to everyone, but then you pay a bit. And obviously that can be a sliding scale according to the country that you're based in, and maybe your role there too, that would then look to funding it. So I think it's something maybe the society could have a sort of collective think about, whether that's, I mean, it'd be very novel. I don't know if any other societies have done it, but I think it's just becoming an increasing, I mean, the more useful and the more global the resources that are being produced, and especially given that they're being produced in an open science way with inbuilt possibilities of updating, it really is, I think, a new but good problem that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, I'm kind of keen on the idea of societies owning these things, because they have a longevity that's and a stability that you know, organizations, community interest companies and so on may not have. You know, they may be here today and gone tomorrow. You know, Society for the Study of Addiction has been around since 1840 something, so it could be around for a few years. Yeah, EHPS, I think we can expect to outlive us. So I suppose the only thing then is whether there would be merit in societies getting together and acting as a sort of consortium there to own it, which I'm sure would be perfectly feasible from a logistical point of view, because a lot of these tools, you know, have relevance, you know, far beyond the individual society. I think that's something definitely worth looking at.
Exactly. I see that is a scientist developed tool, or a series of scientist developed tools for scientists by scientists, and funded by the societies where the scientists are affiliated. So I think it only makes sense, you know, if a consortium of societies, EHPS, DHP, EPS, other societies across the world, APA, who knows, come together and put their money where their mouth is and say, we are supporting open science, we want our scientific field to continue to develop and prosper, I think it would be, in my view, a good way forward.
I think it would be good to partner with organisations that were outside of Europe, because the ones you mentioned are within Europe, and also outside of psychology, because, you know, all the tools we're producing are for a much, much wider set of users than psychologists. So, I mean, Society of Behavioural Medicine or ICBM are obvious partners, but, you know, we could also look to go to Latin America and Africa and, you know, do more kind of consortium of partners that would be more reflective of the globe.
It would also be important, though, to kind of safeguard the open science character, to make sure that everything stays open source, so that anybody else than the societies can actually install it on their servers and run it in parallel. Because, of course, societies at some point, when funding gets even worse, might be tempted to only make it available to society members.
Very good point, yeah.
Is there not a role for funders internationally here as well? I mean, nationally and internationally. So I'm thinking the UK, UKRI, but also, and I'd be interested in Talia's thoughts as well in terms of the NIH and other funding agencies. Clearly there is a public need for the longevity. So I'd be curious also to think what Talia's thoughts might be from the US. If she's still here.
Well, I know that right now we're really talking about how to create something self-sustaining, but we haven't talked about it so much as something that would be funded with some centralized oversight. What we've been really trying to think about, and I think interfacing with the theories and techniques tool as part of this, is how do we make them easy to use? And if people really have a lot of buy-in, then you end up with something that's a little bit more self-policing. So for example, Open Science Framework has done a wonderful job with just having journals endorse them and have badges. And so now people are using OSF all of the time and they're not getting paid to do it. I know that's a little bit different, but in terms of an actual funder to fund like curation of open science resources, I don't think we've really thought about it in that way quite so much.
I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. But there's a parallel session starting now on practical health psychology editors meeting, so good if we just keep time for that. But I think from Elaine and I, and from the Open Science SIG in general, just thank you to all of our speakers today for keeping to time, for giving us amazing food for thought across the event. So yeah, I think from us, goodbye and thank you.
Thanks very much. And
Thank you, Emma and Elaine. Bye-bye.
Contact us if you need
Thank
anything.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.